How is it that for thousands of years people justified slavery and did not question its actual moral legitimacy? Many people were actively promoting it, saying it was necessary for the economy and everything within existence, and that without it, society would fall apart. All that makes civil society would not be existent without some lower class of people who had to do the drudgery of the society. But see, slavery can only be a legal right. It cannot be morally right. Since it is a condition of duress, it may be considered the worst form of wrong, since it is wrong guaranteed and repeated. To reiterate, another being and their property does not belong to you. Morality is not consistent in its principle or use if it's based on privileges that can be granted or revoked at any time and based on fluctuating opinion or the idea that one person can be the source of morality for others. Who are we to impose our will on another human being if we have equality and humility? If we did, we would be in contradiction to the golden rule, and right would simply be dependent upon might. However, as evident upon reading Right is Might by Richard Wetherell, for reference, one can only claim to be the sole moral arbitrator, and they may attempt to convince others that it is legitimate. Therefore, through another perspective, legality is merely imposed morality, and this is the theft of one's own moral compass, conscience, and freedom of choice. For when legality is aligned to morality, there begs the question as to its necessity. If it's actually helping to enforce morality, or if it is actually rather providing space for exception and legitimizing other evils. The so-called radical abolitionist in the 19th century, like one of the most prominent figures, William Lloyd Garrison, deeply understood this concept. Frederick Douglass said about him that he rose not from the power of the church or the state, but in bold, inflexible, and defiant opposition to the mighty power of both. For instance, if we are under God's government, then what use is there for human government? And why would the devoted follower of God support slavery or the state? Despite seemingly like a strange question during the time of abolition to propose the idea of God's government, it is written about extensively at the same time period, 1845, as when philosophical anarchism began. Interestingly enough, the first anarchists in history were considered religious, be it, for example, Christian or Taoist. In correlation, famous psychologist Dr. Carl Jung shares with us in his book The Undiscovered Self about how religion can be the greatest bulwark against the power of the government, or what he calls state doctrine, if it's used in challenging its authority. One may be curious to see how many modern religious followers would so bravely adopt this point of view. The abolitionists mainly utilized this position in giving them leverage over the slave masters who claimed authority over their fellow man, for the many reasons they used as a justification, whether it was racially or economically. In truth, the morality mattered most at the end of the day. For when the governments at the time supported chattel slavery, many of the abolitionists additionally challenged the authority not just of the slave masters, but of the government. Such principles ended many abolitionists in jail, with censorship of their material as well as slander from the media, warning the world of their revolting positions.
Garrison was making powerful enemies. Within months, he was thrown in prison for vilifying a slave trader. A New York sympathizer bailed him out in the spring of 1830. On a hot August night in 1831, a band of armed slaves rode through the Virginia countryside, killing the white occupants of one farmhouse after another. Nat Turner, the man who led the rebellion, would elude a massive search party for 68 days before he too was caught and executed.
There's no evidence that Garrison's Liberator had any influence on Nat Turner, but very quickly in the Southern press, Garrison's name started to be associated with Nat Turner's revolt.
The South Carolina legislature put a bounty on Garrison's head. $15,000 if you could deliver his body. I think more if you delivered the whole man alive.
Having to fight all fronts, they dealt with a world that was justifying an age-old practice that was held mainly due to the superstition and fear that came from conformity, despite knowing in their heart what was truly right. Today we may understand it does not matter how many people have justified slavery in the past, because the act itself is a claim of ownership over somebody who does not belong to the claimant. Even the word justification comes from the Latin noun jus, which means right, and the Latin verb facere, which means to make or to create, meaning to create a right even if it isn't actually right. Carl Jung said in his book, the state has taken the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions and state slavery is a form of worship. But the religious function cannot be dislocated and falsified in this way without giving rise to secret doubts, which are immediately repressed so as to avoid conflict with the prevailing trend toward mass-mindedness. The result, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanaticism, which in its turn is used as a weapon for stamping out the least flicker of opposition. Free opinion is stifled and moral decision ruthlessly suppressed on the plea that the end justifies the means, even the vilest. The policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demigod beyond good and evil, and his votaries are honored as heroes, martyrs, apostles, and missionaries. There is only one truth, and beside it, no other. It is sacrosanct and above criticism. Anyone who thinks differently is a heretic, who, as we know from history, is threatened with all manner of unpleasant things. Only the party boss who holds the political power in his hands can interpret the state doctrine authentically, and he does so just as suits him. And of course, Jung goes on, talking about the whole idea of how the state becomes your god. From audio you can find online from a former slave, he says,
"You can't give me the right to be a human being. I'm born with that right. Now you can keep me from having that. If you've got all the policemen and all the jobs on your side, you can deprive me of it. But you can't give it to me, because I was born with it just like you was." And my God, it had a profound effect on me. I was furious with him. But the more I reflected on it, the more profoundly it affected me. And I realized this was where it really was.
Lysander Spooner, an abolitionist and lawyer, said slavery, if it can be legalized at all, can be legalized only by positive legislation. Natural law gives it no aid. Percy Shelley, an author, said conformity and obedience, bane of all genius, virtue, freedom, truth, makes slaves of men and of the human frame, a mechanized automation. Ayn Rand, the philosopher and author, said if some men are entitled by right to the products of the work of others, it means that those others are deprived of rights and condemned to slave labor. Any alleged right of one man which necessitates the violation of the rights of another is not and cannot be a right. No man can have a right to impose an unchosen obligation, an unwarranted duty, or an involuntary servitude on another man. There can be no such thing as the right to enslave. Henry Clapp Jr., an abolitionist, said, "Might is right is the cornerstone of all slavery." Of course, there's also a quote from the Liberator newspaper talking in detail about how abolitionism is the denial of the right to make man the property of man. Not just the denial of the idea to make man the property of man, but the right, which is significant because when you use the word right, it implies a moral legitimacy. William Lloyd Garrison said, "The wealth, the enterprise, the literature, the politics, the religion of the land are all combined to give extension and perpetuity to the slave power. The tremendous power of the government is actively wielded to crush out the little anti-slavery life that remains in individual hearts, and to open new and boundless domains for the expansion of the slave system. The North has as much to do with slavery, not slaves, as the South. The North does as much to support it, protect it, and extend it as the South. And Garrison, within his writings, also talks about how his newspaper, The Liberator, was being censored at the time and attacked despite being independent and looking at all sides and being able to be free and educative. John Quincy Adams, a philosopher who was known before the abolitionist, even talked about slavery and referred to it being prohibited by the laws of God. Leo Tolstoy said the same thing in regards to natural law, saying that if there be in nature no such principle as justice, there is no moral standard and never can be any moral standard by which any controversy whatsoever between two or more human beings can be settled in a manner to be obligatory upon either, and the inevitable doom of the human race must consequently be forever at war, forever striving to plunder, enslave, and murder each other with no instrumentalities but fraud and force to end the conflict. Mark Passio, a modern-day natural law teacher, said natural law gets boiled down to two words: don't steal. That's it. You want the key out of the prison, you've got to understand property. You ought to understand all rights or property rights. Stop taking the property of other beings. Stop condoning the taking of the property of other beings. The end. Frederick Douglass said, "I have never placed my opposition to slavery on a basis so narrow as my own enslavement, but rather upon the indestructible and unchangeable laws of human nature, every one of which is perpetually and flagrantly violated by the slave system. It is the nature of slavery to beget a state of things all around it favorable to its own continuance. This fact, connected with the system of bondage, is beginning to be more fully realized." Joseph Dejecu, an abolitionist, said, "Who has been moralized by a slave has slave thoughts in the brain. Who is betrothed to a slave, who is the owner of a slave, is betrothed to slavery, is possessed of slavery. If we want for man new destinies, let us engrave the right, this morality of nature, in the heart of his companion. Let's make the oak crown for the girl instead of the orange crown. Let's give a new mold to the human embryo." Rousseau, a famous philosopher before the abolitionist, said, "However we might view things, the right of slavery is null and void, not only because it is illegitimate, but because it is absurd and meaningless. These words, slavery and right, are contradictory and mutually exclusive." Brian J. Butts, an abolitionist, said, "Just so long as the individual depends on the government or the church to settle the moral law, so long will slavery of every hue exist." So what is it about morality and natural law that makes it so contrary to human government and the idea of slavery and man controlling man? It is that idea that an individual can think for themselves and recognize that they own themselves, and that with that power, they are not bound or bond to live by the rules of anybody else who tells them how to live their own life, so long as they respect the right for somebody else to also live their life free and with their own self-ownership. Otherwise, they'd be contradicting their own self-ownership. And so it's a giving and getting scenario. It's reciprocal. And this reciprocal relationship plays out well in the world, as now there is peace rather than chaos or disorder, since people are able to get along. They don't have to agree with each other, they don't have to have the same opinions, but they simply recognize that they own themselves. It is really that simple when you end slavery, when you're able to recognize that everyone's bound to a higher law beyond the whims or dictates from man. So if it really is just that simple, as we can observe from thousands of years of moral statements and moral philosophies that people have created, still, why is it that we justify evils today? Because there are evils you may look around the world and say, this is certainly evil, but people are not paying attention to it. So why is it that evil still exists? Yes, chattel slavery may have ended, But some of these abolitionists are already suggesting there's other forms of slavery. Well, how come these have not been addressed? And are there any evils we have still yet to address? The question is for you, but it's also for our next video in this series. Thank you for watching this part of the docu-series Slavery Gone for Good. Be sure to watch our other parts for a more deep understanding as to the nature of truth and action in its fullest extent. If you want to learn more and hear more quotes that have not been discussed in this video, be sure to buy the book Slavery Gone for Good Black Book Edition. This is the most important work in history, and you are part of that work. Do not forget it. As Frederick Douglass, former slave and abolitionist, said, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave."